Last time, Freiburg's New Zealanders withdrew from the battlefield as both sides entered into a stalemate. Rommel attempted a second dash to the wire, and Cruvel waited for Gambara to turn up at Bir el Gubi. Well, this time Rommel faces the music. Supplies of everything are running out, and the British are bringing up reinforcements. There's only one action left open to him: retreat. Let's find out why. Notes and sources are in the pinned comment, timestamps to various parts of the video are in the description. At 07:48 hours on the 7th of December 1941, Japanese air forces attacked Pearl Harbor, an act that would bring the United States formally into the war. I say formally because the United States was, at this point, anything but a true neutral power. She had been blockading both Germany and Japan, and had been supplying the British and the Soviets with equipment, including the many M3 light tanks and trucks that the British in this battle were armed with. But either way, the sleeping giant had been awoken. This event was unbeknownst to Rommel when he announced to his HQ that if the British were not beaten today, he would have to withdraw to Gazala. And in fact, Rommel had already withdrawn some artillery and the Italian HQ to Gazala in preparation for this move, suggesting that this decision had already been made regardless of the day's events. He was now ordering the Africa Division and his own HQ to fall back as well. Rommel then visited the front and found Cruvel. Cruvel was concerned about the British concentration in the south and told Rommel that the British were far superior to them at this point. The fact was the condition of the Axis troops was getting worse, supplies, especially fuel and ammunition, were becoming scarce, and British artillery continued to fire, which the Germans knew they couldn't match for much longer. It was clear that if the battle continued, the Germans faced complete defeat. In fact, both sides at this point were practically holding hands. In the afternoon, an armoured car stopped in the middle of the battlefield. The commander got out and waved his dust-covered beret. So, all artillery on both sides stopped firing because nobody could tell which side he was on. And because Axis vehicles were in British service and British vehicles were in Axis service, units on both sides ended up driving together until they realised their mistake and broke off. Both sides were so entwined that no coherent attacks could possibly be made at this point. Rommel knew now that the Afrika Korps was spent, while the British were still very much in the fight. Rommel called off all attacks and gave the order for a withdrawal to be made back to Gazala, some 48 kilometers to the west. The reason Gazala was chosen was because, back in May of 1941, construction had begun on a series of defensive positions there and continued into June. This was because it wasn't clear what would happen in the Tobruk area. Those defences had been neglected, but they were better than nothing. German rearguards hit out at British forces, convincing Norrie that Rommel was standing his ground. They were that effective that Gott thought Rommel had received reinforcements. 30 Corps therefore didn't move forwards, so Ritchie and Norrie held a conference to discuss the situation. Norrie was still convinced that Rommel was holding the line, but Ritchie saw through the ruse. It seems that Rommel was striking out to cover the withdrawal. Of course, these strikes kept 30 Corps busy, so an attack wasn't going to be easy. Ritchie therefore told Norrie to keep pressure on the Germans, try to bypass any resistance and advance as soon as possible. On the other hand, Godwin Austen was given an order to move towards El Adam from the El Duda area. He was also ordered to clear all Axis forces in the north between Tobruk and Bardia, which the 2nd South African Division were now busy doing. The frontier Axis troops would be dealt with later. But the only real move 30 Corps made this day was by 4th Armoured Brigade, which began to slowly flank to the south of the German positions. Later, Brigadier Cox's 23rd Infantry Brigade, supported by a few tanks, broke out of the western face of the El Duda salient. Cox advanced almost as far as the Tobruk-El Adam road, which shows just how quick the Axis was now retreating, and elements of the Pavia division were caught at El Adam and lost. Comando Supremo at Rome agreed with Bastico that the Tobruk siege would have to end, but ordered his units to do their best and try and hold on to every part of Cyrenaica. He suggested that an attempt to hold Benghazi should be made. Retreating into Tripolitania would be a last resort. No matter what, Aghdabia should be strongly held and Jalo should be recaptured to prevent a British outflanking attempt. Rommel would certainly try his best, but he himself wasn't happy. He had been forced to abandon the frontier garrisons, including Major Bach, the very elements he tried to save during his dash to the wire, so he certainly didn't want to retreat either. And finally that evening, Ritchie gave everyone prior warning that he was going to adjust the chain of command over the next few days. The battlefield situation required a different setup and he was going to make it. On the 8th of December 1941, Britain declares war on Japan, and Neumann Zilko dies from his wounds in the hospital at Derna. Bastico came to see Rommel at his new headquarters just behind Ain el-Ghazala. Rommel kept him waiting for 15 minutes before admitting him into his mammoth. He then treated him to an explosion of Teutonic wrath, in which he not only blamed the Italians for the failure to beat the British, but announced that in view of the unsatisfactory nature of the cooperation he had received, he intended to take his divisions not only back into Tripolitania, but on and into Tunisia, where he would give himself up to the French and be interned. Emphasizing the shortcomings of Italian troops, Rommel warned that until Gambara's attitude was overcome, and until the Italian divisions had moved behind the Gazala defences, the withdrawal could not continue. Bastico took offence, but agreed that the Italians should retreat. Rommel then agreed to send part of the Africa Division and some Italian artillery to hold Aghdabia. The same evening, Mussolini and the OKH ordered that the frontier positions were to be held and they would be supplied by air and sea. The argument flared up again a few days later, but when Cavallero arrived from Rome to adjudicate, neither Bastico nor Gambara could produce viable alternative strategies and spent most of their time with their chief of staff complaining about Rommel's rudeness. This, they were told, they must grin and bear, and in the meantime they had better comply with their overbearing but efficient allies' suggestions. It was now clear to the British that the Axis were definitely withdrawing from the Bir el Gubi area, although Axis rearguards prevented the British from intervening in that withdrawal. So, Norrie ordered 7th Armoured Division to advance northwest to the track junction, later to become known as the Knightsbridge, 12 miles south of Acroma. 4th Indian Division was to move north to the escarpment, running west from El Adam towards Knightsbridge, and to link together 13th and 30th Corps. On the 9th of December, Bastico issued a directive. Rommel is made field commander of all Axis land forces in Cyrenaica, meaning he was now allowed to commit Italian forces when and where he saw fit. This also meant that Gambara's corps was now fully under Rommel's command. Better late than never, but the Axis command crisis was now over. Also on the 9th, Ritchie adjusts the chain of command, which he had warned about on the 7th. 13th Corps is now to control operations to drive the enemy out of Cyrenaica, and 30th Corps would clear Axis forces on the Egyptian frontier. This would allow one commander to control the forces in each area, simplifying the command structure. Norrie suggested that his 30th Corps was probably better suited to drive the Axis out of Cyrenaica, since it had more experience with mobile operations. However, Ritchie disagreed. There was now only one armoured division, which had only one armoured brigade in it, so the majority of the units were infantry, 13th Corps speciality. Also, Auchinleck was contemplating withdrawing 30th Corps to form a reserve force. There was also a possible attack coming from the Caucasus, since German troops had entered it. This wasn't as serious an operation as would be conducted in 1942, and indeed it was thrown back, but the threat was real enough for Auchinleck to be concerned. So yes, 30th Corps would deal with the frontier forces, and 13th Corps would deal with Rommel. By the 10th of December, the Brescia and Trento divisions had withdrawn from the western half of the Tobruk perimeter. Axis forces were now no longer maintaining any siege lines around Tobruk for the first time since April 11th, 8 months earlier. Of course, it had taken 3 weeks to get to this point instead of 1 week as planned at the beginning of Crusader, but at least this was something to celebrate for the British. Now, the problem of supply began to plague the British. The Germans were at least falling back on their supply lines, even if they were receiving a trickle. The British, though, were advancing away from their supply bases, and the cross-desert truck convoys were getting stretched thinner and thinner. They had to go across the desert because the Germans and Italians still held on at Halfaya, Bardia and Sollum, which blocked the coastal road. Some stores had been built up in Tobruk prior to the battle, but most of these had been eaten during the prolonged breakout attempt, so the relief of Tobruk didn't immediately solve the supply issue. However, Tobruk did provide new landing grounds for the RAF in the Tobruk, El Adam, Sidi Rezai and Bu Ahmed area. Because of fighter cover, ships could now offload in Tobruk during the day, and it was hoped that this would relieve some of the pressure, although it would take some time to take effect. Also, with these advanced bases, British fighters could now provide the advancing troops with some protection and support. In fact, on its move towards Agadabia, the Africa Division was hit by RAF fighter sweeps, one of which killed General Major Max Sumerman this evening. Yes, both Panzer divisions had lost their original commanders, and the Africa Division now lost theirs. The Germans had lost 3 generals, and the Africa Division would also be without a leader for some time. And these weren't the only commanders losing their heads. Probably because of Rommel's complaints, Gambara resumed his duties as Chief of Staff to Bastico and was replaced by General Piazzoni of the Trieste Division, who was now in command of 20th Corps. Piazzoni would be replaced by General Azzi the next day. Speaking of the next day, on the 11th of December, 7th Armoured Division and the 4th Indian Division were officially transferred to 13th Corps. Given the shortage of fuel, it seemed unlikely that the Germans and Italians could stop the British from outflanking the Gazala position to the south. Rommel knew that he'd have to fall back again if the British attempted this. Hearing that, Mussolini sent a message to Bastico and said all points should be considered before a decision is made to withdraw. He came up with loads of excuses: the heavy British losses, the fact that Cunningham had been replaced, Japan's entry into the war. Anything and everything he could think of was suggested in order to prevent a withdrawal. On the 12th of December, Bastico assumed that Mussolini's message gave him responsibility for deciding when to withdraw or not. So he sent a slightly modified version of Mussolini's message to Rommel on the 12th of December, adding that they would stand at Gazala and there would be no withdrawal. Rommel dismissed this, saying that they wouldn't be able to hold out too long there anyway. Meanwhile, 30 Corps was moved to the frontier area. The British also knew what the Gazala position was and had a fairly accurate assessment of where Axis forces were. Below the Alam Hamza Ridge, there was no defences, so there was a possibility to outflank the Axis positions. Therefore, 22nd Guards Brigade was taken over by Ritchie himself, who prepared to send it across the desert to secure Benghazi as soon as possible, with the hope that this might also prevent Axis forces from retreating into Tripolitania. Also on this day, Churchill ordered Auchinleck to send 2 divisions, plus bombers, anti-tank guns, and later 100 M3 light tanks to the Far East. At the same time as Auchinleck was thus weakened, his command was extended to include Iraq and Persia and the troops already there. He was now responsible for the northern defence of the Persian Gulf oil fields in the event of a Russian collapse in the Caucasus. Yes, once again, Churchill intervenes during the middle of a British advance and dilutes the strength of the army, just like during Operation Compass. Seriously, whose side is this guy on? The British reached the Alam Hamza Ridge on the 13th of December and see that the enemy intended to stand and fight. Godwin-Austen therefore hoped to force a decisive battle. 15th Panzer Division had just 23 operational tanks, 21st Panzer had 19, and while the Arete Division's number is unknown, it was probably also low. So in theory, the Axis wouldn't be able to offer a great deal of resistance. The British, on the other hand, had 90 tanks in 7th Armoured Division, all under the command of Brigadier Gatehouse. So they clearly had the advantage in number of tanks, and in Godwin-Austen's new plan, Gott was told to destroy the German armour completely. 5th New Zealand Brigade was ordered to pin the enemy east of Gazala. On the left of the New Zealanders, the Polish Brigade from Tobruk would swing north and cut the coast road west of Gazala. 4th Indian Division would attack westward from Alam Hamza, and the 7th Support Group would deal with the enemy south of Sidi Breghisk. Meanwhile, 4th Armoured Brigade was to make a wide flanking movement. Unfortunately, while this attack was planned to go in on or around the 15th, Rommel made it clear to the OKH that he was probably going to withdraw during the night of the 14th to the 15th of December. Bastico was clearly not happy with this, and thought that the Gazala Line could be held. He was also suspicious of Rommel, and thought that if a crisis did occur, the Germans would just leave the less mobile Italians to their doom. Bastico was also under the impression that he alone could make the decision to withdraw or not, but Rommel seemed to be acting without Bastico's permission, so he asked Mussolini for clarification. Who should make the final decision to withdraw? On the 14th, a compromise was reached where they would hold for now, but prepare to withdraw to Derna or Mechili. Meanwhile, Godwin-Austen ordered Gott to outflank the Axis lines, but Gott couldn't do that because his force was suffering from breakdowns and logistical shortages. So the attack was delayed until the next day. Then Gott received a message from home saying that his father-in-law, Brigadier Kayes, had died, which no doubt added to his problems. Otherwise, on the 15th of December, 13th Corps attacked. The New Zealanders made some progress and took several hundred Italian prisoners, as did Kopansky's Polish brigade, but Kopansky couldn't get around the west of Gazala, and both brigades of the 4th Indian Division had a hard day. 1st Battalion, the Buffs, of Russell's 5th Indian Infantry Brigade reached point 204 by going south and then hitting it from the west. At this point, the rest of the brigade should have come from the south to take Alam Hamza, and the 7th Indian Infantry Brigade should have captured Sidi Breghisk. But both of these attacks failed. Then in the afternoon, Axis artillery pounded the Buffs, signalling a counterattack by 8th Panzer Regiment, 2nd Machine Gun Battalion and the 8th Bersaglieri Regiment. Again, I just want to point out that some sources don't mention the Italians in this action. After an hour and a half, the Germans and Italians shattered the lone battalion. The Buffs also had one squadron from 4th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, 31st Field Artillery Regiment and one troop of 73rd Anti-Tank Regiment in support. These were crushed as well, resulting in 1,000 men killed, captured or wounded. But this action was also quite bad for the Germans. 8th Panzer Regiment lost up to a dozen panzers from the 23 they had at the beginning of the day. And with the Germans distracted, this action allowed 4th Armoured Brigade to get around the flank. 4th Armoured Brigade went 70 miles, cutting the Tamimi to Mechili road. This was a tough ride though, and the M3 light tanks drank all their fuel, which is why they were delayed by 4 hours. They were meant to have arrived there at 11 AM. Worse, Gott was now informed that the follow-up petrol convoy wouldn't reach them that day, meaning he would have to move them back south the next day to rendezvous with the fuel. 13th Corps was told that the 4th Armoured Brigade would not be ready for action until the afternoon of the 16th of December, so this hadn't been quite a decisive a move as hoped. Godwin Austen replied that once it was ready, it should attack the enemy opposite, 4th Indian Division. 4th Indian Division would wait until 4th Armoured Brigade was ready, but in the meantime Gott was ordered to send a column to cut the coast road at Infamy. Rommel saw the move of the 4th Armoured Brigade on his right flank and thought it was heading for Mechili. This convinced him that a withdrawal had to happen overnight on the 16th to 17th of December. 21st Corps was directed through Infamy to Derna, and 20th Corps and the Germans were sent to Mechili. Rommel's retreat to El Agheila was on. The main thing on Rommel's mind now was to avoid getting trapped in the bulge of Cyrenaica, as the Italians had done at Bedafom the year before. Doing that would be the end of the Africa Corps and had to be avoided at all costs. Cavallero and Field Marshal Kesselring flew from Rome to try and resolve the differences between Bastico and Rommel. The argument was made that events on the Eastern Front, or in the Far East, might influence the campaign. Therefore, the primary course of action now was to stall for time in North Africa until the tide of war changed. Tripolitania was to be defended, even though reinforcements were not forthcoming. Cavallero then flew to see Rommel in the afternoon, only to learn that the troops were already withdrawing from Gazala. Cavallero complained that abandoning Cyrenaica would be a catastrophe for Italy. Rommel replied sharply that losing the whole of Tripolitania would be an even bigger one. Libya was an Italian colony. Many of these same men had been responsible for its loss to the British less than a year before. Most of them had been quite openly obstructionist when he had been trying to retake Libya that spring and summer, and now they were demanding that the Panzer Group make a stand against 8th Army in the same place that the Italian army had stood the year before, where it could be destroyed in the same manner and for the same operational reasons the Italian army had been destroyed 10 months earlier. Their protests fell on stone-deaf ears. Rommel was determined to concentrate around El Agheila and Marada. Cavallero agreed, but stressed that Cyrenaica should only be given up gradually in order to save everything that they could. At 0700 hours, 4th Armoured Brigade moved south, met up with the supply trucks and replenished its fuel stocks. The small column that had been sent to Infamy shot up a few vehicles and captured some prisoners, but ran out of fuel and therefore fell back, allowing the Axis retreat to continue. Just after noon, 4th Armoured Brigade moved to the area south of Sidi Breghisk and there exchanged fire with some Axis guns. Godwin Austen could see the Axis getting away, so he urged Gott to cut them off and prevent them from retreating. Gott was unable to get the 4th Armoured Brigade into action though, and the RAF couldn't apply much pressure because the forward bases hadn't been prepared yet. So the opportunity to do some real damage to the Axis was missed, and Rommel slipped away. Meanwhile, at the frontier, de Villers launched an attack against the northwest front of Bardia. Bahrain's 3rd South African Brigade went in, and a fierce fight broke out, which saw the South Africans getting bogged down. Axis strength and morale at Bardia were higher than was expected, and Bahrain's attack, which would continue for 2 days, achieved little. On the morning of the 17th of December, Cavallero and Rommel talked again. Rommel stated that he would try and hold on to Derna and Mechili, but he said it was obvious that if the British got to Mechili, or to the south of it, he would be compelled to retreat from Cyrenaica. Cavallero agreed with Rommel's assessment of the situation. Meanwhile, Ritchie believed that Rommel would fight delaying actions in the Derna and Mechili areas. He therefore ordered 4th Indian Division to move to Lamluda and push the 7th Armoured Division towards Mechili. 7th Support Group was to move around the southern flank and harry the enemy as far west as possible, the exact thing Rommel was hoping wouldn't happen. In addition, Marryat's 22nd Guards Brigade was even further south and was ordered to head straight for Benghazi. However, Marryat's unit was unable to start this drive for another 3 days. That afternoon, a German air report confirmed that the 7th Support Group were advancing towards Tengaga. Rommel informed Cavallero, who questioned the report. It seems Cavallero was doing everything he could to prevent a retreat from Cyrenaica. He even asked for a delay of the retreat, claiming that Italian troops were exhausted and short of transport. Rommel dismissed this again, saying the retreat must begin. Only a mobile rearguard would remain in the east. At this point, Rommel ordered General Cruvel to move to the area south of Benghazi and told him to be ready to operate towards Aghdabia. The Italians were to head directly for Benghazi. Cavallero protested. He even had Bastico and Gambara at his side, and all of them made it clear that they weren't happy. But there seemed to be little choice now. Cyrenaica had to be abandoned. By the evening, the Afrika Korps and Italian armour were moving from Mechili to Massos, and the Italian infantry continued along the coast roads. British armour chased after them, but massive petrol shortages saw them delayed. Throughout this time, Air Vice Marshal Conyngham targeted the German and Italian airfields by night as well as by day. Having been forced back, Axis airfields were congested and were hit hard. Coupled with the hasty retreat, huge numbers of aircraft were simply abandoned on the airfields, further increasing British air superiority. Realising that the enemy did not intend to stand at Derna or Mechili, Ritchie now changed 22nd Guards Brigade's mission. It was now directed towards the coast south of Benghazi and to prevent the enemy from withdrawing south. Godwin Austen also ordered Gott to press on to Benina and Benghazi. Yes, the British were aiming to cut off Axis forces before they could escape to the south. Would this be a repeat of the Battle of Beda Fom during Operation Compass, which saw the destruction of the retreating Italian 10th Army? We'll find out next time. Yes, Operation Crusader is being won by the British. I know, it's unreal. Considering how bad the British messed this up, and that the Germans had practically won it, we're now seeing an Axis retreat, which could end in disaster if the British are able to cut them off at the coast. And if this does happen, could the British drive off towards Tripoli and secure all of Libya? They lost that chance during Operation Compass. Would they make the same mistake again? Next time, we'll see. And we'll also discuss the battle in its entirety. Yes, the next episode is the final Crusader episode, the end of the battle and the analysis of the entire campaign. It's going to be good. Thanks for watching, bye for now.